April rain falls steadily on the southern ridges of Okinawa. It turns coral dust into mud. Smoke hangs low, pressed down by the weather and the weight of weeks of fighting. A Japanese infantryman lies motionless near a shattered limestone outcrop. His uniform is dark with blood. He has been taught that capture means shame, that the enemy shows no mercy. He waits for the final sound, a rifle shot, a bayonet, the end. Instead, he hears boots stop nearby. Voices speak English, calm but urgent. A man kneels beside him, not with a weapon, but with bandages. The American wears a red cross on his arm. He does not ask questions. He does not look for insignia. He works quickly, pressing gauze against a wound torn open by shrapnel. Around them, artillery continues to thunder. The battle for Okinawa does not pause. Yet in this narrow moment, amid one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War, an unexpected act unfolds. An enemy wounded, treated by the very force he was ordered to fear. That moment will echo far beyond this hillside, carried in memory by those who survived to tell it. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had narrowed to a final, violent corridor. Japan's outer defenses were gone. The Philippines had fallen. Iwo Jima was secured at enormous cost. Only one major land barrier remained between American forces and the Japanese home islands. That barrier was Okinawa. Located just 350 miles south of Kyushu, Okinawa was not merely another island. It was a gateway. Its airfields could support heavy bombers. Its harbors could anchor invasion fleets. From Okinawa, the planned assault on Japan, Operation Downfall, would be launched. On April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, U.S. forces came ashore. More than 180,000 troops from the U.S. 10th Army, Marines and soldiers together, pushed onto the beaches. Unlike earlier Pacific landings, there was no immediate resistance. The beaches were quiet, too quiet. Japanese commanders had learned from defeat. General Mitsuru Shijima and his chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, did not intend to contest the shoreline. They abandoned the beaches and prepared a defensive system inland, layered, concealed, and deadly. The fighting would not be fast. It would be slow, grinding, and deliberate. Southern Okinawa was carved with ridges, caves, and limestone escarpments. Every hill could be fortified. Every tunnel could hide a machine gun, a mortar, or a wounded soldier. The Japanese 32nd Army, heavily outnumbered and undersupplied, relied on terrain and discipline rather than maneuver. Their doctrine allowed no retreat, no surrender. Wounded men were often expected to remain in place, to fight until they could not, or take their own lives rather than fall into enemy hands. Civilians were trapped in between. Okinawa's population exceeded 400,000. Many were conscripted as laborers or medics. Others were driven into caves as artillery pounded the island day and night. The Americans advanced methodically. Artillery prepared the way. Naval gunfire shook the earth. Air support filled the sky. Yet each gain was measured in yards, not miles. By mid-April, the battle had settled into a brutal rhythm. Assault, counter-fire, rain, mud, casualties. The casualty figures rose with terrifying speed. Units that landed at full strength were reduced by half in weeks. Shrapnel wounds, burns, fractures, and blast injuries overwhelmed frontline aid stations. This was not a war of sweeping breakthroughs. It was a war of attrition. And in this environment, one group moved constantly forward, without rifles, without cover, and without the option to pause: the combat medics. American doctrine placed medical personnel close to fighting. Each rifle platoon had a medic assigned. They advanced with the infantry, exposed to the same fire, often more. Their role was simple in definition and impossible in execution: reach the wounded, stop the bleeding, and keep them alive long enough for evacuation. Okinawa tested the system to its limits. Japanese fire did not discriminate. Mortars fell without warning. Snipers targeted movement. Caves erupted with sudden gunfire. Medics were wounded and killed at rates comparable to frontline infantry. Yet they continued forward. What Japanese soldiers observed in those weeks challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy. They saw American medics crawl toward fallen men under fire. They saw them ignore rank and nationality. They saw treatment given where execution had been expected. At first, these moments were isolated, a single encounter. A wounded man left alive longer than expected. But as the battle dragged on, the pattern repeated. And slowly, amid the destruction of Okinawa, a realization began to form. One that would unsettle long-held beliefs on both sides of the battlefield. That realization was rooted not in weapons or tactics, but in how each army treated the broken bodies left behind by modern war. Before a single American soldier landed on Okinawa, both sides entered the battle with radically different beliefs about injury, surrender, and survival. These beliefs were not shaped in combat. They were formed years earlier in training grounds, classrooms, and ideology. For the United States military, battlefield medicine had become a system. Hard lessons from North Africa, Italy, and the Central Pacific had refined it. Every infantry platoon was assigned a medic. Every company had an aid station. Behind them waited battalion and regimental clearing stations, field hospitals, and hospital ships offshore. The goal was not merely to save lives. It was to return soldiers to the fight whenever possible. American medics were trained to work under fire. They learned to stop hemorrhaging, stabilize fractures, treat shock, and manage burns. They carried morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, bandages, plasma, and tourniquets. Speed mattered. Minutes often meant the difference between life and death. Just as important was doctrine. Under U.S. Army and Marine Corps regulations, medical personnel were non-combatants. They carried no weapons. They wore Red Cross armbands. Their obligation was clear. Treat the wounded without discrimination. This obligation extended beyond nationality. The United States was a signatory to the Geneva Convention of 1929. Enemy wounded, once incapacitated, were to be collected, treated, and evacuated when feasible. This was not presented as mercy. It was presented as law and professionalism. On Okinawa, this principle would be tested in ways few could have anticipated. The Imperial Japanese Army operated under an entirely different framework. Japanese military medicine existed, but it was uneven and under-resourced by 1945. Supplies were scarce. Trained medical staff were limited. Evacuation under sustained artillery and air attack was often impossible. More significant than logistics was ideology. The Japanese soldier was taught that surrender was dishonor. To be wounded and captured was to disgrace one's family, one's unit, and the emperor. Medical care was secondary to duty. Those too injured to fight were often expected to remain behind, to assist if possible, or die in place. In this system, the enemy medic had no place. American behavior contradicted everything Japanese soldiers had been told. They had been warned that capture meant torture, that Americans were brutal, racially inferior, and vengeful, that no quarter would be given. Yet on Okinawa, reports filtered through the caves and tunnels. Men spoke of comrades who had been wounded, then bandaged by the enemy, of water offered, of morphine administered instead of a bullet. At first, these stories were dismissed. Battlefield rumor, psychological weakness, enemy deception. But the encounters continued. U.S. medics treated wounded Japanese soldiers for practical reasons. Leaving a wounded man to die slowly posed risks. He could detonate a grenade. He could draw fire. He could attract civilians. Stabilizing him reduced danger. Still, many medics acted from a deeper motivation, training reinforced by conscience. They had been taught that once a man was wounded, he was no longer the enemy. He was a patient. There were risks. Japanese soldiers sometimes feigned injury, then attacked. Medics were killed in such incidents. Word spread. Caution increased. Yet the doctrine did not change. Captured Japanese wounded were brought to aid stations alongside Americans. They received similar care, often with interpreters or captured medics assisting. Some were evacuated to rear hospitals. Others died despite treatment. For Japanese soldiers who witnessed this, the experience was destabilizing. The enemy they had been conditioned to hate behaved in ways that defied expectation. It did not end the fighting. It did not erase loyalty. But it introduced doubt. And in a battle defined by relentless violence, that doubt would grow more powerful than any leaflet or broadcast. As Okinawa descended into its bloodiest weeks, the battlefield became a place not only of destruction, but a moral collision. where two visions of war confronted each other in the space between life and death. That collision would soon intensify as individual encounters multiplied under the pressure of sustained combat. Angle 1, the medic for the American combat medic. Okinawa was a test without precedent. He moved forward with a rifle platoon, often just steps behind the lead squad. He carried no weapon, only a medical bag heavy with bandages, plasma, and morphine. When the firing started, he did not drop prone and wait. He moved toward it. Medics learned quickly that visibility was danger. The Red Cross armband, intended as protection under international law, often drew fire instead. Japanese snipers targeted movement. Cave mouths erupted without warning. Mortar fragments tore through aid stations marked clearly on maps. Yet the work continued. A medic crawled through mud to reach a Marine screaming with a shattered leg. Another waded into shellfire to pull a wounded man behind cover. They worked with bare hands, cutting uniforms away, packing wounds, stopping blood loss. Then there were moments they had not trained for. A Japanese soldier lay nearby, wounded, still breathing. Doctrine offered no ambiguity. If he was no longer a threat, he was to be treated. The medic approached carefully, hands visible, eyes scanning for grenades or sudden movement. He spoke calmly, though the words were not understood. Bandages were applied. Water was offered. Morphine administered if needed. There was no ceremony, no pause for reflection. The battlefield did not allow it. For many medics, these acts were remembered not as heroism, but as routine. They had been trained to see injuries, not uniforms. Blood was blood. Shock looked the same in any language. Still, they understood what they were witnessing in the enemy's eyes. Confusion, fear, disbelief. Angle 2, the wounded enemy. For the Japanese soldier who had been hit, consciousness faded in and out. Pain blurred time. Training returned in fragments. Do not surrender. Do not be captured. He expected death. Instead, hands pressed against his wound. The pain changed, controlled, slowed. He noticed the smell first, antiseptic, unfamiliar, then the calm urgency of the medic's movements. No shouting, no anger. For some, this moment shattered years of indoctrination. They had been told Americans were savage. That capture meant torture. That mercy did not exist. Yet here was care. Some wept. Some stared in silence. Some tried to push the medic away, confused by the contradiction. A few reached for grenades and were restrained. Survival brought its own shock. Those who lived were moved rearward. They passed American wounded on stretchers. They saw aid stations functioning under fire. They heard English spoken without hatred. Later, in captivity, many would recount this moment as the first time they questioned what they had been taught. Not because they admired the enemy, but because the enemy did not behave as expected. Angle 3, the tactical reality. From a tactical standpoint, medical care was inseparable from combat effectiveness. American commanders understood this. Rapid treatment reduced fatalities. Faster evacuation returned men to duty. Morale improved when soldiers knew they would not be abandoned. On Okinawa, where casualties were constant, this mattered. Medics became anchors within units. Their presence reassured troops advancing into caves and ravines. Men fought knowing someone would come for them if they fell. This stood in contrast to Japanese units, where wounded soldiers often remained behind, unable to withdraw. These men became isolated. They suffered unattended injuries. They died slowly. American patrols encountering these wounded soldiers faced a choice: neutralize the threat or stabilize the casualty. Often, both occurred. Once treated, wounded Japanese soldiers were less likely to resist. Some provided information. Others simply waited. These interactions did not alter the battle's outcome in the immediate sense, but they altered the human terrain. As weeks passed, more Japanese soldiers came to understand that capture did not guarantee death. The knowledge spread unevenly, but it spread. In a campaign defined by attrition, this shift, small, fragile, and incomplete, began to exert quiet influence. And as the fighting reached its most violent phase, these individual moments of care would intersect with mass casualties, overwhelming terrain, and decisions made under unbearable pressure.